Did you know there's a war that never really ended? A war so brutal that millions died. But it's often called the Forgotten War.
You're talking about the Korean War, right? It's the conflict that divided Korea into North and South and still keeps them apart today.
Exactly. It all started in 1950, but the story behind it goes back even further. Colonial rule, a divided country, and Cold War politics. The war became a battlefield for global superpowers like the US, China, and the Soviet Union.
And the fighting didn't just leave scars on Korea's land. It destroyed cities, families, and futures. Even now, the tension between North and South Korea feels like a ticking time bomb.
But this isn't just a story about politics or battles. It's about survival, tragedy, and the human cost of war.
So grab a seat and join us as we dive into the Korean War, how it started, the battles that changed its course, and the people caught in the middle of this frozen conflict.
And don't forget to share your thoughts and tell us whose story you want to hear next. Ready? Let's begin.
To understand the Korean War, we need to go back to the end of World War II. Korea wasn't always divided, you know. For thousands of years, it was a single, unified kingdom. But everything changed in the early 20th century.
Right? In 1910, Japan took over Korea and made it a colony. For 35 years, they ruled Korea with a tight grip. They forced Koreans to adopt Japanese customs, speak Japanese, and work for their empire. It was harsh.
Absolutely. Then came World War II. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Korea was finally free. But freedom didn't last long. Instead of uniting, Korea was divided almost overnight.
That's because the United States and the Soviet Union stepped in. They agreed to split Korea along the 38th parallel. The North would be under Soviet influence, and the South would be under American control. They said it was temporary, but it didn't turn out that way.
It didn't. And the two sides started forming their own governments. In the North, the Soviets supported Kim Il-sung, a communist leader. In the South, the Americans backed Syngman Rhee, a strong anti-communist.
The problem was that both leaders wanted control of the entire Korean peninsula. They refused to recognize each other's government. It wasn't just a political disagreement. It created real tension, especially at the border.
That's true. By 1948, the division was official. North Korea became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and South Korea became the Republic of Korea. It wasn't long before both sides started skirmishing along the 38th parallel.
And let's not forget the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union were already locked in a global struggle. Korea just became another chessboard for them.
Exactly. By 1950, the border between North and South Korea was a powder keg. It only needed one spark to ignite a full-blown war. And that spark came on June 25, 1950.
The day North Korea invaded the South. But that's a story for the next part. Let's pause here and think about how quickly this small country became a battlefield for the world's biggest powers. It's tragic, isn't it?
It really is. A divided land, foreign influence, and two leaders who wouldn't back down. It was a recipe for disaster.
June 25th, 1950. That's the day it all started. North Korean forces launched a massive surprise attack across the 38th parallel. Within hours, the Korean War had begun.
And it wasn't just a small raid. This was a full-scale invasion. North Korea's army, the Korean People's Army, had been trained and armed by the Soviet Union. They had tanks, artillery, and well-organized troops. The South? They weren't ready for this at all.
That's an understatement. South Korea's military, the Republic of Korea Army, was under-equipped and under-trained. They didn't even have tanks or heavy artillery. Their focus had been on fighting communist guerrillas inside the South, not preparing for a massive invasion.
Exactly. The North's forces pushed southward fast, taking city after city. By June 28th, just 3 days into the war, they had already captured Seoul, South Korea's capital.
That was devastating. People were panicking, fleeing their homes. Entire families were torn apart. And as the North advanced, reports of atrocities started coming in. Executions, forced conscriptions, even massacres.
The South didn't give up, though. What was left of their army regrouped in the southeast, forming what became known as the Pusan perimeter. This was their last stronghold, and they were barely holding on.
That's when the United Nations stepped in, right?
Yes, the UN condemned North Korea's attack and called for member nations to help South Korea. 21 countries answered the call, but the United States played the biggest role. They provided most of the troops, weapons, and supplies.
It wasn't just about defending South Korea, though. For the U.S., this was also about stopping the spread of communism. Remember, the Cold War was in full swing, and they saw this as a test of their resolve against the Soviet Union and China.
True. But even with UN support, things didn't look good at first. By August, South Korea and the UN forces were barely hanging on at the Pusan perimeter. The North's forces were closing in, and defeat seemed inevitable.
It must have been terrifying for those on the ground. Soldiers, civilians, everyone. The situation was desperate.
Desperate, yes, but not hopeless. Reinforcements were arriving, and a bold plan was being made behind the scenes. A plan that would turn the tide of the war. For now, it's clear that the early days of the war were marked by chaos, fear, and rapid changes. The North had the upper hand, but the story was far from over.
By September 1950, it seemed like the war was all but lost for South Korea. North Korea had control of almost the entire peninsula, except for a small area in the southeast, the Pusan perimeter.
But this is where the story takes a dramatic turn. General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of the United Nations forces, came up with a bold and risky plan. He wanted to launch an amphibious landing behind enemy lines at the port city of Incheon.
Incheon? That sounds crazy. It's narrow, has strong tides, and isn't exactly easy for landing troops.
Exactly. Even MacArthur's advisors thought it was too dangerous. But MacArthur insisted, and on September 15, 1950, the landing went ahead. It was a gamble, but it worked.
The element of surprise was everything, wasn't it? North Korea never saw it coming.
That's right. UN forces quickly captured Incheon and pushed towards Seoul. By the end of September, they had liberated the capital and cut off North Korean supply lines. It was a turning point.
And it didn't stop there. UN and South Korean forces pushed north, crossing the 38th parallel. For the first time, they weren't just defending, they were advancing into North Korea.
By October, they had captured Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, and were pushing toward the Yalu River, which borders China. It looked like the war might end with the complete defeat of North Korea.
But that's when China entered the picture, right?
Yes, China had warned the UN not to approach the Yalu River, but the warnings were ignored. On October 19, 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops, known as the People's Volunteer Army, crossed the Yalu and launched a surprise attack.
The UN forces weren't prepared for that at all.
No, they weren't. The Chinese used clever tactics, like attacking at night and cutting off communication lines. By December, UN forces were retreating south. Seoul fell again in January 1951, marking the second time the city changed hands during the war.
It must have been chaotic. So much back and forth in just a few months.
It was. Soldiers and civilians were caught in the middle of it all. Entire families fled south, trying to escape the fighting. The war wasn't just a clash of armies anymore. It was a humanitarian disaster.
And yet, despite the setbacks, the UN forces regrouped.
They did. By March 1951, the UN launched a counteroffensive and recaptured Seoul for the final time. The fighting eventually settled along the 38th parallel, but the entry of China turned what could have been a short war into a drawn-out conflict.
It's incredible how quickly everything changed, from near defeat at Pusan to advancing into the north, and then being pushed back by China. The Korean War was far from over.
Far from it. The next stage of the war would become even more brutal, a long, bloody stalemate that lasted for years.
By mid-1951, the Korean War had reached a grim turning point. After so much back-and-forth fighting, the front lines stabilized near the 38th parallel. That's when the war became a brutal stalemate.
Stalemate might sound boring, but it wasn't. The fighting didn't stop. Both sides dug into defensive positions, creating trench systems like something out of World War I. Soldiers faced constant artillery fire, sniper attacks, and raids in freezing winters and scorching summers.
And the battles were fierce, even over small pieces of land. Places like Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, and Pork Chop Hill became infamous. Thousands died fighting for territory that would be lost and regained over and over again.
The conditions were awful. Imagine spending months in trenches, with mud everywhere, barely any sleep, and constant fear of attack. Some soldiers said the worst enemy wasn't bullets, it was the cold.
While this was happening on the ground, the war also moved to the skies. The United Nations forces, especially the US, dominated the air with bombers and fighter planes. North Korea became one of the most heavily bombed countries in history.
Entire cities were destroyed. It wasn't just military targets. Factories, bridges, and even farms were bombed to cut off supplies. Civilians suffered the most. Millions were killed, injured, or left homeless.
And yet, the bombing didn't break the resolve of North Korea or China. They kept sending troops to the front lines, no matter the cost.
Meanwhile, negotiations to end the war started in 1951. But those talks dragged on for years. Both sides argued over key issues, like prisoner exchanges and the exact location of the border.
And during those talks, the fighting continued. Neither side wanted to give up any advantage, so they kept pushing. It was a war of attrition. Who could hold out the longest?
The human cost was staggering. By 1952, millions of civilians had already died, and the soldiers were worn down. It wasn't just the front lines. Guerrilla warfare and purges caused chaos in the South, too.
You know, it's easy to think of a stalemate as quiet or uneventful, but this one was anything but. It was a time of unimaginable suffering for everyone involved.
And it set the stage for the eventual armistice. But before that could happen, the war would take even more lives and leave scars that haven't healed to this day.
By 1951, both sides realized the war wasn't going to end with a clear victory. The front lines barely moved, yet thousands of soldiers and civilians were still dying. That's when peace talks began.
The negotiations started in July 1951 at Kaesong, near the front lines. Later they moved to Panmunjom, but calling them peace talks is a bit misleading. There wasn't much peace in the process.
That's true. They spent months just arguing about basic things, like where the border should be. Should it stay along the 38th parallel or move to reflect the shifting front lines?
And don't forget the issue of prisoners of war. The United Nations forces wanted prisoners to choose whether they'd return to their home countries, but North Korea and China demanded all prisoners be sent back, no questions asked.
That became one of the biggest sticking points. For some prisoners, going back to the North or China meant facing punishment or worse. The UN didn't want to force anyone into that.
Meanwhile, the fighting never really stopped. Both sides kept trying to gain the upper hand, thinking it might give them more leverage at the negotiating table.
The battles during this period were brutal. Places like Old Baldy, the Iron Triangle, and White Horse Hill became symbols of the war's senseless destruction. Soldiers fought and died for hills that were barely more than piles of rubble.
And the civilian toll kept climbing. North Korea, in particular, suffered from constant bombing. Entire cities were turned to ashes. People lived in caves trying to survive.
The longer the war dragged on, the more pressure there was to end it. The U.S. had a new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who made it clear he wanted the fighting to stop.
And in 1953, something big happened. Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, died. That changed the dynamics. Without Stalin pushing for continued war, North Korea and China were more open to compromise.
Finally, on July 27, 1953, the armistice was signed. It wasn't a peace treaty, but it stopped the fighting. A demilitarized zone, or DMZ, was created along the front lines, which were close to the 38th parallel.
The DMZ was supposed to be a temporary solution, but it's still there today. It's a 4-kilometer-wide strip of land that divides North and South Korea.
And the war technically never ended. No peace treaty has ever been signed. It's still just an armistice, leaving the Korean peninsula in a state of tension.
The Korean War was a tragedy that left millions dead, families separated, and cities destroyed. The armistice brought relief, but it didn't bring peace.
When the guns finally fell silent in 1953, the devastation was overwhelming. Millions of lives had been lost, and the Korean peninsula was in ruins. But the pain of the war didn't end with the armistice.
Absolutely. Let's start with the numbers. Around 3 million people died, and most of them were civilians. Entire families were wiped out, and those who survived were left homeless, hungry, or separated.
And in North Korea, the destruction was unimaginable. U.S. bombing campaigns flattened nearly every city. Pyongyang, the capital, was almost completely destroyed. People lived underground to escape the constant air raids.
In South Korea, it wasn't much better. The North's invasion, followed by years of fighting, devastated farmland and cities. Refugees fled south in huge numbers, hoping to find safety, but there wasn't much to be found.
And then there were the orphans, tens of thousands of children left without parents. Many ended up in orphanages, and some were adopted by families abroad.
That's right. The war left deep scars, not just on Korea, but on the soldiers who fought there too. Many veterans returned home with physical wounds, but the mental scars were just as severe.
For some soldiers, the war became a lifelong burden. They fought in brutal conditions, far from home, and often felt forgotten. Especially in the United States, the Korean War didn't get the attention or recognition that World War II or Vietnam did.
And let's not forget the political aftermath. North Korea became even more isolated, with its leadership focusing on military power and control. Today, it's one of the most secretive and heavily armed countries in the world.
Meanwhile, South Korea started to rebuild with the help of the United States. Over time, it transformed into a thriving democracy and one of the world's largest economies.
But the division of Korea remains. Families who were separated by the war are still divided. Some have been able to meet through brief reunions, but for many, it's been decades of silence.
The DMZ, that strip of land along the 38th parallel, has become a symbol of both division and hope. It's one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world, but it also reminds us that peace is still possible.
And that's what makes the Korean War so heartbreaking. It's not just a story of loss and destruction. It's a story that's still unfinished. The conflict may be frozen, but the wounds it caused are still very real.
Exactly. The Korean War wasn't just about borders or politics. It was about people, millions of lives forever changed by violence, loss, and survival.
So, after all the devastation and sacrifices, what can we take away from the Korean War? It's been over 70 years, but its impact is still shaping the world today.
Absolutely. One of the biggest lessons is how quickly conflicts can escalate. What started as a regional border dispute turned into a global war, with the United States, China, the Soviet Union, and 21 other countries involved.
And it wasn't just about Korea. The war marked the beginning of the Cold War's proxy conflicts, where superpowers fought indirectly by supporting opposing sides in smaller countries. Vietnam, Afghanistan, and others followed the same pattern.
It also showed how devastating modern warfare could be. The bombing campaigns in North Korea and the massive civilian toll were grim reminders of the human cost of war. And yet, despite all the suffering, the Korean peninsula remains divided.
That division is one of the war's most enduring legacies. The DMZ is a constant reminder of what happened and what could happen again. North and South Korea have taken such different paths, yet the tension between them still lingers.
And that tension affects the whole world. North Korea's nuclear weapons program keeps global leaders on edge. Every decision made, there feels like a ripple from the Korean War.
But it's not all negative. The war also strengthened alliances. South Korea became one of America's closest partners, and organizations like the United Nations showed their ability to respond to aggression, even if imperfectly.
And let's not forget South Korea's incredible recovery. From being one of the poorest nations after the war, it grew into an economic powerhouse and a leader in technology and culture. That transformation is inspiring.
Still, the human side of the story can't be overlooked. Millions of families were torn apart, and for many, the pain of separation remains. Reunions between divided families are rare, and time is running out for many who experienced the war firsthand.
And that's why the Korean War shouldn't be called the Forgotten War. It may not get as much attention as other conflicts, but its effects are everywhere, in politics, culture, and the lives of the people who lived through it.
Exactly. The war may have ended with an armistice, but the story isn't over. The question of peace and reunification is still waiting for an answer.
And until that answer comes, the Korean War will remain a lesson, a reminder of the cost of division and the importance of striving for peace.
And that brings us to the end of our journey through the Korean War, a conflict that reshaped a nation, divided a peninsula, and left a mark on history that's still felt today.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into history. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know whose story you'd like to hear next.
And don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep exploring these stories.
Until next time, take care and keep learning about the stories that shape our world.